In one of his most poignant statements, Marx envisioned a communist society where life would be from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. For years throughout the world, people with disabilities were invisible. We stayed home, taken care of by our families, or we were warehoused in hospitals and other institutions. In the late 60s, this began to change. In New York City, I first learned of the plight of the disabled people who were warehoused in institutions when reporter Geraldo Rivera exposed the conditions of Willowbrook, a state hospital in Staten Island. A doctor there had tipped him off that the conditions were filthy and the staff was abusive. To his credit, Rivera visited the facility, photographed the conditions, and stayed on the case until Willowbrook was closed down. And it wasn't just in New York. I heard another case, a radio interview of an amazing woman, a nun in Rhode Island, who had taken an oath to serve. Ultimately, she became the state attorney general. She had seen the terrible conditions of a local facility and wanted to shut it down. As Attorney General, she threatened the authorities that if they didn't close it down, she would, and did. With all the people leaving institutions, a movement for independent living began, and this movement is global. I attended a conference last year in Washington, D.C., where half of the attendees were Japanese. Parents and students had fought for education. I remember a documentary I saw in 1967 that still haunts me. It was about a man in an iron lung who fought to get an education at the University of California at Berkeley. The university ultimately agreed, made the necessary architectural accommodations, and he went flat on his back on a rolling gurney with a heavy iron lung on his torso. Living an independent life means challenging many of the things that the public at large takes for granted, in particular access to public transportation. It's a key link. You can't hold a job if you can't get there. Medical care is also critical. Medicaid helps pay for the services that enable independence. When Trump tried to eliminate Medicaid, there was an eruption. Members of a very dedicated group called ADAPT, mostly in wheelchairs, sat in Mitch McConnell's office for 3 days until they were arrested and thrown out. Undaunted, 2 weeks later, they filled the Senate chamber chanting, "Don't kill us, kill the bill," during the final vote when the bill was defeated by 1 vote. All the rights to normal life have not been won yet. We are clinging to the workforce by our fingernails. Steadily increasing technology is helping. Many disabled people are quite adept at using and designing it. There is a large spectrum of abilities disabled people have. On the one hand, you have Professor Stephen Hawking, a brilliant physicist who wrote A Brief History of Time, among other books explaining the universe in popular language. Hawking had ALS, which affected his ability to speak. So he talked through a computer from his wheelchair. Helen Keller, blind and deaf, learned how to do more than talk. She was an author, a political activist, in fact, a socialist and a lecturer. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are good at repetitive tasks. Once learned, they can be very useful. When I lived upstate New York, there was a man at the local YMCA who performed janitorial duties, the same duties every day in the same order. He was all right as long as you didn't change his pattern. He is respected for his contribution. Upstate New York and elsewhere, there are, quote, sheltered workshops where employers bring work for disabled in the community. One of the largest corporations in the region is IBM. They would bring circuit boards to the workshop and have the disabled workers wire them up. For this, the workers were paid $2 an hour. For years, disabled workers have been paid sub-minimum wage. It is codified in the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. The Depression-era Act does have some good points: an 8-hour day, no child labor. But its dark side is that it allows employers to pay sub-minimum wages to quite a few categories of workers: the disabled, waitresses, prisoners, etc. 4 states, Alaska, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maryland, have recently eliminated sub-minimum wage. Edward Udelovich and I have been working with the National Federation of the Blind to develop a strategy to eliminate it in New York State. We are hoping that as more states eliminate sub-minimum wage, the law can successfully be challenged at the federal level. Disabled people are fighting to get into the workforce and are activists, like the activists at the recent People's MTA action at the Museum of the City of New York. Activists claim that all work has value and are helping to realize a society where work is performed, to paraphrase Marx, from each according to his ability and shared to each according to his needs. Thank you.